Since the very dawn of human civilization, our species has suffered from a profound, incurable, and ultimately fatal delusion. It is the blinding, arrogant belief that we have achieved absolute mastery over the natural elements and the terrifying, unseen forces of the physical universe. Through the unrelenting engine of the Industrial Revolution, we convinced ourselves that we were no longer subjects of nature, but its undisputed gods. We learned how to rip apart the very molecular foundations of the Earth, rearranging volatile chemicals to create concentrated, unimaginable destructive power. We pack thousands of tons of this raw, apocalyptic energy into the cold, rusted steel bellies of our massive ships. We sail these floating powder kegs across violent, freezing oceans, treating the very instruments of global annihilation as if they were mere crates of mundane cargo. But the unforgiving, absolute laws of physics and chemistry do not recognize human hubris. They are entirely blind to our grandiose ambitions, completely deaf to our political excuses, and absolutely devoid of mercy. ZE, human hubris. Chemical reactions do not care about the wars we wage, the empires we seek to expand, or the innocent civilians sleeping in their warm beds. And when we arrogantly disrespect the rigid, emotionless boundaries of these volatile forces, nature does not issue a warning. It only takes a single, microscopic human error, a fleeting moment of stubborn, foolish pride, to unleash a cataclysm that can erase an entire city from the face of the earth in a fraction of a millisecond. The year is 1917. The month is December, a time when the bitter, biting chill of the North American winter begins to freeze the breath in your lungs. We find ourselves in the bustling, densely packed and highly strategic port city of Halifax, located on the freezing, rugged shores of Nova Scotia, Canada. Across the dark, turbulent waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the catastrophic, industrialized meat grinder of the First World War was raging with unprecedented mechanical brutality. Because of this relentless global conflict, the deep, naturally protected, and icy harbor of Halifax had rapidly, unnaturally transformed. It had become one of the most critical, heavily congested, and chaotic logistical nerve centers on the entire planet. The narrow, damp cobblestone streets of the city were overflowing with exhausted, mud-covered soldiers, anxious local families, and soot-stained factory workers. The gray, freezing waters of the harbor were dangerously choked with a massive, endless armada of merchant cruisers, troop transports, and heavy steel warships. These massive metal leviathans were all desperately waiting in the freezing fog to form massive convoys for the highly dangerous, submarine-infested journey to the European front lines. On the morning of Thursday, December 6th, a cold, crisp, and deceptively beautiful winter sun rose slowly over a city that felt entirely ordinary and peaceful. Tired dock workers were starting up their heavy, grinding steam machinery, filling the cold air with the smell of burning coal. Children, bundled in thick wool coats, were walking along the icy sidewalks toward their brick schools. Families were sitting in their warm wooden homes, quietly eating their morning meals behind frosted glass windows. No one in that bustling, breathing, living city could possibly comprehend that they were existing in the final ticking minutes of their reality. They had no idea that they were standing on the very edge of the largest, most devastating artificial explosion in human history prior to the atomic bomb. Out on the freezing, dark, and highly congested water, in a treacherously narrow and notoriously difficult strait known locally as the Narrows, two massive steel ships found themselves on a fatal, inescapable collision course. One of these vessels was the SS Imo, a large, empty, and highly uncooperative Norwegian ship that had been chartered to carry desperately needed relief supplies to war-torn Belgium. The other was a battered, heavily loaded French cargo ship named the SS Mont-Blanc. But the Mont-Blanc was not a normal, mundane merchant vessel. It was quite literally a floating, unarmored weapon of mass destruction. Deep inside its dark, rusted, and claustrophobic iron belly, the ship was packed to the absolute brim with a terrifying, apocalyptic arsenal. It carried over 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, a highly sensitive and extremely powerful high explosive. It held over 200 tons of highly volatile TNT, packed tightly into heavy wooden crates. It carried dozens of tons of highly explosive gun cotton, resting silently in the pitch-black hold, and in a display of breathtaking, incomprehensible negligence, stacked directly on its open, exposed wooden decks were hundreds of leaking, fragile metal barrels of highly flammable benzol aviation fuel. The Mont Blanc was a giant floating chemical bomb, possessing more concentrated destructive energy than entire armies held on the Western Front. Yet, due to the deeply paranoid, secretive, and highly classified rules rules of wartime shipping, the Mont-Blanc flew no red warning flags to signal its apocalyptic cargo to the surrounding city. It was a ghost ship of pure, unadulterated explosive death, disguised as a harmless, slow-moving freighter, creeping silently through a densely populated, completely oblivious civilian harbor. In the claustrophobic, incredibly narrow and unforgiving waters of the strait, a deadly, arrogant game of nautical chicken began between the captains of the two massive vessels. Through a tragic, escalating series of miscommunications, misunderstood whistle blasts, and a fatal, stubborn refusal to yield the right of way, the two ships were drawn together like unstoppable magnetic forces. In the freezing, crisp morning air, the heavy, rusted steel bow of the empty SS Imo slowly, agonizingly carved its way directly into the starboard side of the floating bomb, the SS Mont-Blanc. The physical impact between the two leviathans was not a deafening, catastrophic crash that shook the city. Rather, it was a slow, grinding, deeply unsettling, metal-tearing screech that echoed across the freezing water. But the mechanical and chemical damage was already done. The heavy physical impact of the collision violently toppled the massive stacks of fragile benzol barrels on the Mont-Blanc's wooden deck. The metal barrels cracked and burst open, spilling hundreds of gallons of thick, highly flammable, highly volatile aviation fuel across the shattered, splintered wood. The highly combustible liquid rapidly seeped through the cracked decking, dripping silently into the dark cargo holds below, directly toward the mountains of picric acid. As the captain of the SS Imo panicked and immediately reversed his massive engines to pull his heavy steel bow out of the deep gash, the absolute laws of physics intervened. The grinding, immense friction of heavy rusted steel violently scraping against heavy steel produced a massive, aggressive shower of brilliant, fatal sparks. Those tiny, glowing, superheated embers fell like a deadly rain directly into the pooling, highly volatile liquid benzol. Instantly, a violent, aggressive, and entirely uncontrollable chemical fire erupted on the deck of the Mont-Blanc. Within seconds, thick, toxic, pitch-black chemical smoke began to aggressively billow hundreds of feet into the cold, pale Canadian sky, accompanied by terrifying, intense bursts of bright orange flames. The French crew of the Mont-Blanc knew exactly what was sleeping in the dark, suffocating cargo holds just inches beneath their feet. They knew that fighting a rapidly spreading benzol fire, sitting directly on top of nearly 3,000 tons of military-grade high explosives, was an absolute mathematical impossibility. In a state of sheer, unadulterated, and primal panic, the captain ordered the crew to immediately abandon the doomed, burning vessel. They scrambled desperately, wildly into their wooden lifeboats, lowering them into the freezing water and rowing frantically toward the distant opposite shore. As they rowed for their lives, they screamed desperately into the freezing wind, waving their arms, trying to warn anyone who could hear them that the ship was a ticking, apocalyptic bomb. But they were shouting in French, and their desperate, terrifying warnings were completely lost in the howling wind and the tragic language barrier of the English-speaking port. Abandoned by its creators, the blazing, smoking ghost ship caught the harbor currents and began to drift silently, aimlessly, and inevitably toward the shore. It drifted directly toward Pier 6, right into the heart of Richmond, one of the most densely populated, bustling working-class neighborhoods in all of Halifax. And it was in this exact, tragic, and heartbreaking moment that the most vulnerable and fatal flaw of human psychology took hold of the entire city: curiosity. The massive, towering column of thick black smoke and the spectacular, abnormally bright flames rising from the harbor acted like a hypnotic, irresistible beacon. The people of Halifax had never seen a chemical fire of this magnitude. Soot-covered factory workers paused their heavy machinery, leaving their assembly lines, and stepped out onto the cold wooden docks to watch the spectacle. Civilians stopped in the middle of the freezing cobblestone streets, their eyes fixed upward on the burning Leviathan drifting toward them. Most tragically, most heartbreakingly of all, hundreds of innocent families and children, safe inside their warm homes and classrooms, rushed to the walls. They pressed their faces tightly against the thin, fragile, freezing glass of their windows to get a better look at the beautiful and mesmerizing fire on the water. It was a moment of pure, collective, and entirely fatal ignorance. They stood there in the quiet morning, absolutely mesmerized by the flames, completely unaware that they were staring directly into the eyes of an apocalyptic monster that was about to vaporize their reality. They watched the burning ship bump gently against the wooden pier, setting the docks themselves on fire. The local fire department arrived, bravely rolling out their hoses, standing just feet away from a hull packed with enough explosive power to shatter a mountain. The time is exactly 9:04 in the morning, deep inside the dark, suffocating belly of the Mont Blanc. The raging, uncontrollable fire finally burns through the wooden decking and reaches the volatile, unstable mountain of picric acid. The SS Mont-Blanc detonated. To call what happened next an explosion is a profound failure of human language. It was an unnatural, absolute, and geological cataclysm. In a fraction of a single millisecond, the incredibly violent chemical chain reaction generated internal temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Celsius. This temperature briefly matched the absolute blinding heat of the surface of the sun itself. Right there in the freezing waters of Nova Scotia, the 3,000-ton heavy steel ship did not just break apart, it instantly, entirely vaporized into a blinding cloud of superheated plasma and expanding gas. The sheer kinetic force of the blast was so unimaginably violent, so profoundly powerful, that the ship's massive half-ton iron anchor shaft was blown completely out of the harbor. It was launched high into the stratosphere, flying over the entire city before crashing deep into a silent forest over 2 miles away. The barrel of the ship's forward gun landed nearly 3.5 miles away in another direction. The water surrounding the ship instantly, violently boiled and evaporated, exposing the muddy, rocky floor of the harbor for a terrifying fraction of a second. But the true horror was the blast wave. A colossal, invisible, and completely unstoppable shockwave of heavily compressed air blasted outward from the epicenter at more than 3,000 kilometers per hour. It moved faster than the speed of sound, creating an invisible, solid wall of atmospheric pressure that tore across the freezing water and slammed directly into the shores of Halifax. For the hundreds of curious civilians pressing their faces against the glass windows of the city, the universe ended in a flash of blinding, absolute white light. In an instant of absolute, incomprehensible horror, every single glass window within a 3-mile radius violently, explosively shattered inward simultaneously. The fragile domestic panes of glass were instantly transformed into a deadly, invisible, high-speed storm of jagged shrapnel. The flying glass mercilessly blinded and tore through the flesh of the innocent men, women, and children who had only wanted to watch the fire. In the blink of an eye, thousands of people were permanently stripped of their sight, plunged into an eternal bleeding darkness. The invisible blast wave hit the working-class neighborhood of Richmond with the wrath of an angry, vengeful god. Massive iron factories, heavy stone churches, and hundreds of tightly packed wooden and brick homes were instantly, mercilessly reduced to microscopic splinters and toxic dust. Entire city blocks were flattened into a desolate, unrecognizable wasteland in less time than it takes to draw a breath. People walking on the streets were instantly vaporized, leaving nothing behind but shadows etched into the burning stone. In less than 1/10 of a second, nearly 2,000 human beings were violently, brutally erased from existence. Over 9,000 more were left severely mutilated, deafened, blinded, and trapped, crushed beneath the instant burning ruins of their own homes. A thriving, breathing, energetic city was instantly transformed into a flat, burning wasteland of apocalyptic despair. But the unyielding, cruel laws of physics and nature were not yet finished with the bleeding, shattered city of Halifax. The explosive displacement of the atmosphere was so severe that it created a momentary, massive vacuum directly over the harbor. The blast violently pushed millions of tons of heavy ocean water away from the epicenter, but water always inevitably returns to fill a void. Seconds after the blast, the displaced ocean rushed back in upon itself, forming a terrifying, massive, pitch-black tsunami wave that surged nearly 60 feet high. This colossal, unstoppable wall of freezing, toxic, debris-filled water violently crashed over the ruined docks. It mercilessly swallowed the wreckage, the burning fires, and the desperate, bleeding survivors who had miraculously just lived through the explosion. It dragged hundreds of people out into the freezing, dark abyss of the harbor, never to be seen again. As the day faded into a terrifying, pitch-black night filled with agonizing screams, the smell of cordite, and the glow of burning rubble, nature delivered its final, most cruel blow. The skies over Nova Scotia darkened aggressively, and one of the most severe, punishing winter blizzards in Canadian history descended upon the ruined, defenseless city. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, accompanied by howling, merciless gale-force winds. Heavy, relentless, blinding snow began to aggressively bury the smoldering wreckage in a thick, freezing white shroud. Hundreds of trapped, wounded survivors, pinned beneath heavy wooden beams and collapsed brick walls, slowly, agonizingly, froze to death in the dark. They died unable to be rescued, their faint cries for help completely swallowed by the howling wind and the accumulating snow. Human arrogance, poor communication, and a simple failure to yield had ignited the apocalypse. But it was the cold, emotionless, and absolute wrath of nature that delivered the final agonizing silence to the city of Halifax. The Halifax explosion stands today as a stark, blood-soaked, and permanent monument to the terrifying consequences of human hubris. It is a chilling, unforgettable reminder that no matter how massive our steel ships become or how advanced our chemistry seems, we are never truly in control. A single moment of stubborn pride can unleash dormant forces that can instantly, violently erase us from the earth, turning our greatest achievements into toxic ash. Humanity would not see this level of instantaneous, vaporizing destruction again until decades later, beneath the terrifying atomic shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. History is not dead. It is never dead. It only waits, buried deep beneath the frozen, shattered glass and the heavy snow of our past, waiting to be remembered. You are watching past Resurrected. Until the next era,